Students and participants, we're really excited to have you back as we continue to iterate and expand on the course. We are starting a session of bringing in very interesting people who are in this space, either researching in this space or practitioners in this space. And the first, colleague that we're bringing in to start off is Jon Zieger, who is a co-founder and director of a new nonprofit that recently launched called the Responsible Innovation Labs. And Jon has a really interesting background. He's a lawyer by training, worked in large law firms, then transitioned in-house to work for Microsoft for almost a decade, is my understanding. And then he went to a small startup called Stripe, which then is now a very large technology fintech company. And so he brings that experience and through that professional experience has thought a lot about these issues that we talk about on our course. And on the back of that momentum from his career foundation, he started this new initiative called the Responsible Innovation Labs. And we're just here to learn more about Jon and his journey, what the Responsible Innovation Labs are doing, and just have a nice discussion because a lot of what he does ties really well into our course. So Jon, welcome to you. And let me introduce you to our thousands of students virtually, I guess.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, David. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So let's just start with this. What was your motivation for launching Responsible Innovation Labs, RIL? What was your motivation for that? And what are the objectives that you have in mind?
Yeah, I mean, so RIL came out of a series of discussions that I had with a number of founders, a number of entrepreneurs, but especially my two co-founders, Hemant Taneja and Dita Van Lamone, who are folks I got to know very well. And we shared sort of a similar thesis, right, which is fundamentally technology and innovation driven by ambitious technology companies is a kind of superpower for the world. It is a way to bring improvements to human life at scale and rapidly in ways that are pretty hard to replicate in any other way, right? So it's one in humanity's toolkit. Ambitious technology companies are one of the most important tools we have. Certainly there are others, but it's a very important one. So in that sense, very pro-tech, right? And as somebody, as you allude to, I've spent my whole career in the technology industry, either directly or indirectly as a lawyer for the tech industry. So very much a believer and a beneficiary of technology. But, also you look at the last decade in the world and some of the trends we've seen that have resulted from a kind of move fast and break things ethic around technology, not really thinking very hard about the consequences of what we're building, in many cases, assuming that we could sort of solve big problems at scale, but not really addressing them earlier on, clearly has resulted in some significant problems for the world. And as you think about applying that sort of ethos over the next decade or two, as we bring increasingly powerful technologies to market and deploy them very broadly, you can see obvious problems, right? And so that sort of motivated us to think, well, what can we do from inside the industry, from fundamentally pro-tech perspective, that can help shape the industry in a better direction? And that's kind of the genesis of Responsible Innovation Labs.
Well, I'm curious. I always feel like, and I think there are a lot of potential, what I call inflection points in people's kind of life stories or their life arc. And so was there a particular moment where you thought, hey, this is like a big deal? Or was it just kind of a natural, maybe evolution of, hey, I've spent a lot of time in the industry and you started thinking about it? In your situation, what was that origin story like?
It was probably more evolution than a particular moment in that sense. Some of the issues that we faced over post-2016 around electoral manipulation, some of these things that I might put in the category of kind of platform governance. It certainly was a topic that I ended up spending a lot of time on, and one where I felt like in talking to colleagues in other companies, in talking to people outside of our company and even outside of the industry, that was the issue that seemed to me to most clearly suggest the opportunity for an effort like ours, in the sense of creating something that was collective and could arm the industry to do better on these things without having every company try to tackle it on their own.
Gotcha. So you used a phrase earlier in your response. You said something about platform governance, and I think that's a really interesting concept. And so maybe if you could just explain from your perspective this idea of what platform governance is, why is it important in the context of the work you're doing, or the topics that are related to this course?
I think about platform governance and we talk about it from this perspective. One of the things that software does is it's a tremendous tool of amplification, right? You can, from a very small base, allow individuals or companies to reach large audiences, right? So, Facebook maybe is the easiest one, that people will grasp. A single individual can reach many individuals around the world with essentially zero marginal cost of distribution. There are lots of other examples like that where a tool provides access to a large audience and does it very inexpensively. So this power of amplification is common to lots of different kinds of platforms. There are B2B platforms, there are B2C platforms, there are lots of different kinds of platforms. Our view is that in creating this sort of power of amplification, you create really a need to govern that, right? Once you've given someone the power to reach way beyond where they could ordinarily reach without your tool, you now need to think about how that tool is used. It's really thinking about who should be able to use your platform, your service, and under what circumstances. How do you allow them to get access to it in the first place? Under what circumstances do you curtail that access? What kind of process do you associate with that, right? If you're going to take away the ability to use that platform, when is it appropriate to do that, and under what safeguards? And then what kind of transparency should there be about what you're doing? Obviously, when you create a platform, if it's effective, if it's a meaningful platform, it has a lot of value to your users. So if you're going to take it away from them and deprive them of the ability to use it, well, you need to really think about how you're going to do that. For us, platform governance is coming up with a kind of holistic system for deciding who gets to use your platform, when you take that use away, what's the process, the safeguards around that, and what level of transparency do you have about that?
Yeah, so that's really interesting, this idea of the governance aspect. And I think the way you describe platform, that was really clear, and it will tie into people's intuitive understanding of maybe the different platforms that they use in their life, be it a Facebook social media type of platform or other types of information platforms that they're able to access on the internet. What's interesting to me is this what you described about the governance, though, and I think that's maybe we can drill in on that a little bit. Sometimes when I talk about this in different sessions with students, I'll do a quick online poll in class and say, hey, privacy issue or some sort of a governance issue when it comes to a platform, who's responsible? And I give them options. Is the government responsible? Is the actual technology company responsible, or is the user responsible? And it's been interesting because I've given talks to government folks, policy folks, and they'll inevitably say, oh, it's the user or the technology company that's responsible. And then when I go talk to my students, like the younger students, like undergrads, for example, they'll say, oh, the government is responsible. Predominantly. And it's very interesting to see this dichotomy. And I think what you said is this holistic understanding, I think, is really important, because ultimately, I think we know that not just one entity can solve it all, right? We can't just rely on the government, or we can't just rely on the user, either because of information asymmetry, because of regulations, or whatever it may be. But I want to kind of build on that background then by asking, obviously in the last few years, and even ongoing right now, we've seen a whole wave and a coming wave of regulation or threat of regulation of technology companies, either from an anti-monopoly perspective, or from a data security perspective, or a privacy perspective. And we see this in Europe, we see this in America, we see this in China. And so from your perspective, I guess, what is the role of regulation in this kind of broader narrative? And how does that play into the work that you're doing and how you're thinking about, the RIL mission, I guess?
I think the reality is there are certain sets of things that will be very hard for industry to self-regulate. I think this is generally true of privacy. I think this is true of financial services, which is relevant to a lot of your students. Well, there may be some industry-driven efforts. In most cases, you are going to need to see regulators step in, and we have already, in both of those cases, seen there's a lot of regulatory activity. Outside of that, I think there's a lot more room for industry and even within those areas, fintech, for example, I think there's still quite a bit of space for industry self-regulation. One of the problems you have with governmental regulation, and the European example is a good one here, is that the pace of institutions is relatively slow, even where they are pretty well resourced, even where they have some streamlining. Certainly the legislative process is a multi-year process, and the regulatory process tends to be at least a year or two process. And so almost by definition, that is a much slower pace than technology develops itself. And I think the role that industry self-regulation can play is, one, to move faster, two, to be closer to the technology and the running of these businesses, and to create a degree of connective tissue where governmental regulation can lay out big direction and big kind of requirements, and ultimately industry self-regulation can fill in the details at a pace and at a level of detail that would be hard for government to do. And so we think that there's our role, our effort with RIL is not to supplant regulation. We think there are important spaces in some of the areas we've talked about and others for government to regulate, but that ultimately the industry needs to pick up the mantle and fill some of that void and address the kind of pacing and proximity to the technology that would be hard for the government to do. And I think one of the phenomena you see, and I'll sort of stop with this, is that the tech industry in particular, I think there's been a broad current of saying, well, the government needs to solve that. It's not on us, the government needs to solve that, right? That's a government issue. And I think we've reached a point on a lot of these issues where industry needs to lean in and have a view of what good is. It's not going to be the only view, and there's going to be a role for government, but by leaving this sort of vacuum where government is too slow and too far away to regulate, and industry is just waiting for government, we create this space for, I think, a variety of problems to develop. And we've seen a number of those in different parts of the industry. And so we're going to have to lean in as an industry. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do, is say, let's take up some of that space and start to put some markers down as to what we think good looks like. And then if government wants to come in and have different points of view, that's, we can have that conversation.
Yeah, no, that's a great response. And that actually builds on a few course things, but one maybe I'll focus on just really briefly is you talked about the slow pace of legislative or regulatory change. Technologies are advancing very rapidly, but perhaps society and then the reflection of that through laws and regulation is always falling behind. And so we describe that in our course as this concept called culture lag. And so this idea that there's always a lag behind technology, either from a cultural perspective or from a legal perspective. So the law or regulators, like you mentioned, effectively will always be behind anyways. But secondly, I think what we find, like we see these huge headlines. Oh, X, Y, and Z technology company fined huge amount of money. And, oftentimes, and you'll know this well, oftentimes that huge amount of money to the average person, wow, that's a lot of money. To that company, maybe not a lot of money, particularly if they're able to pay that out over, say, like 5 years or 10 years, which is typically the case for a lot of, companies that end up being fined. Technology and non-technology companies, they typically don't have to just drop that money lump sum all at once. But then secondly, a lot of times those companies can fight that fine, right? And so then this ends up prolonging, this idea of, are they actually being punished? I think that's really a great point that you raised. I think the other thing I'm really glad that you raised, I think we mentioned this in our course as well in kind of a discussion that we have. I think 10 years ago, yes, as recent as 10 years ago, how you describe, if you had a developer or an entrepreneur sitting in Silicon Valley or some other tech hub building something, and then people started talking to them about the ethics and risks of something, they said, hey, that's not my responsibility. My responsibility is to build a really cool product. And it's the government's responsibility or some regulators' responsibility to figure out like how they want to regulate it. But I'm just going to build a cool product. And I think that's starting to change just in the last few years. I mean, when our course was launched, at the time, we were really one of the first courses, online or offline, to even like start kind of raising these issues independently. But now I think a number of the top computer engineering, computer science departments, like Stanford is a great example. There was a New York Times article about Stanford rolling in ethics courses into their technology programs just a few years ago, pre-COVID. And so I think a lot of these programs are starting to do that. And I think since top programs like at Stanford or MIT, for example, are doing that, then other programs will also follow along. So I think that's great.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's right. The examples you cited, there's a number of other NYU. There's a bunch of places that are making this much more part of how they're educating students, which is great. And I think, I mean, one of the interesting phenomena is, if you think about the shape of your life, Miley, here we are, talking to one another from across the world on this sort of free video app. I mean, it's, there is a way in which the fabric of our individual lives, what's possible for us economically, how we perceive information, all of that has been shaped dramatically by technology, increasingly. The space that was shaped by government, or kind of a governmentally mediated, structure of the world, versus what was shaped by private companies bringing technology, was just much different. Like it was just much different. And so now, we've moved to where there's a kind of practical, I hesitate to use the word sovereignty because it maybe has the wrong connotation, but a kind of practical sovereignty of technology, right? There is the shape of its power to sort of shape the world kind of independently without the mediation of government has grown tremendously. And it's grown, and that pace has increased over time, certainly over my lifetime. And so I think it does create this place where, we talk about innovation and the power to bring technology to market. I think people need to think of it with some of the seriousness of purpose that we have, we once reserved for thinking of public service, right? Of governmental service, right? Like there's a way in which, certainly if you're working in a venture-backed technology company, right? I think one of the reasons those companies are so successful is, obviously you have very, very bright, very motivated people at the, running those companies, and that's certainly an important part of it. But it's also because they're given access to enormous amounts of capital, which is often institutional capital, right? It's other people's capital that's being deployed there. With that capital and those smart people are also coming other really smart people. So it's also kind of, in some sense, society's intellectual resources, right, that are being deployed there, right? And through all of that, of course, we know that it's not just with those kinds of investments, doesn't just come money. It also comes connections and advice and all of, right? We're taking this tremendous societal resource, and we're giving it to entrepreneurs and sort of helping them to deploy it, which is great. And again, we benefit enormously from that. But in that, in the ability to do that deployment of human capital and financial capital and interconnectedness and all of that is a kind of high calling. And I think, part of our hope in doing this with Responsible Innovation Labs is to kind of call people to that higher calling, right? And arm them to do it really, really well. And really think about their impact on society. And we want to see more people go and innovate and do these things, but do it with a degree of kind of purpose and thoughtfulness that maybe hasn't always been there.
I think that's really great, in some ways inspirational, and I think that gives a higher purpose to entrepreneurs who want to go down that path. I think that the mantle of responsibility that comes from what you described, from the financial capital that's provided, from the human capital that's being offered, as well as the social capital that that results in kind of bringing it all together. I think that's a great perspective about a higher purpose, that maybe a higher responsibility that folks that choose that path maybe should feel as they continue to progress. So when I think about entrepreneurs, when I think of my own students who have go down that path, when they start down that path, they everything we're discussing, they think this is great. They want to contribute to society. They want to, give back. They don't want to, they've been subject to this being taken advantage of, from a privacy perspective. So, they're like, oh, we want to be, we don't want to do that in our startup. And then what I see, and this is what, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on. If we think of a life cycle of one of these startup companies going from, bootstrapping to starting to receive external capital, then to receiving public capital, maybe as a listed company, is there a particular point where the pressure of external investment then starts really impacting how companies, do a trade-off between, we have these principles related to responsible innovation versus we have these demands from investors who want a return on capital.
External investors, they are in the company for return on capital. Fundamentally, the venture capital business runs and is successful, and you get the privilege to raise more funds because you have return on capital, and so that pressure will be there, and what and the external investor will expect not just a return on capital, but will have a time horizon associated with that, right? There's, typically funds have. Our hope in doing this, and one of the kind of motivating ideas behind Responsible Innovation Labs is, if you can bake in responsibility into the DNA of the company, into the way that the company crafts its culture, in particular into the way that the company crafts its core incentives, right, its business model incentives, that as you face various kinds of trade-offs along the way, whether it's to exploit user data in particular ways or to grow in some ways, that you have constrained yourself in ways that make it somewhat hard for you to violate your own principles as you've built into the company, right? Now, does that mean you can't? You can't? No, it doesn't. Obviously, entrepreneurs face hard trade-offs, and there will be times when they go against a commitment that was made earlier. But I think the more you build that into how the company perceives itself, how it's talked to the market and its own, its employees and its customers about what its value proposition is, the harder it is to deviate from that later on. And so there absolutely is a way, I think, in which we think that you're in some sense kind of intentionally building some guardrails so that later on, as you go faster and faster, and it's just hard for you to fly off the side of the road because you built those guardrails. Doesn't mean you can't, but you made it a little harder.
Yeah, and so John, I think that's great, and I think this kind of connection into basically leadership and management and culture is really important. And I think sometimes it gets overlooked because we tend to think of technology as a science, right? And like, like the kind of the soft skills of business, that just matters for the CEO, but all of us we're just focused on the technology. But I think it's interesting when you talk about like incentives and the culture. I as you were mentioning that, I just recalled I was doing like a kind of this organizational training session with kind of a large company, and not a technology company. The gist of it was, hey, we want to have our leaders and kind of middle to senior managers really accept this responsibility of this reorganization that we're going through, and we want them to lead on all of this. And I was like, okay, that's great. And I said, so what's the challenge? I was like, well, it's hard. And they listed out all these reasons why it was hard. And so I asked them, I said, so ostensibly your organization does performance reviews at some interval, maybe annually, maybe quarterly, whatever it is. And when you do those reviews, are these people, these managers that you want to lead out on this initiative, are they being evaluated on that? They said no. I was like, okay, that's why it's never going to happen, right? And I think this is the point you're making, effectively. Like, if you want leaders, managers, technologists at these companies to get that ingrained, obviously you want the leadership and everybody to say the right things. But if you don't like kind of trickle that down into the behaviors of how they're acting, how they're going to be assessed and evaluated, and make that equally as important, or at least somewhat important to other factors that they're being evaluated on, then it's really hard.
Totally. I mean, I 100% agree. And I think we, as an example of the kind, I think our hope is that what you will see through this and some of the stuff that we'll push out will be around board governance and getting to a place where you start to have a set of questions around these various pillars of responsibility, where you're measuring for them, right? And as a board, you're being at least transparent among yourselves between management and the board. Where are we on these things, right? And we think that companies, for example, for a lot of business models, there are potential negative externalities of what you're doing, right? I mean, so Facebook, let's take that example because it's obviously one that's been talked about a lot, right? The impacts on sort of social division, let's just call it kind of generally, the ways that it's tended to create political polarization and various kinds of societal polarization, or to amplify those things that were maybe already kind of latent in the culture, but it's really kind of amped them up. That's not an unknown thing, right? There are smart people at Facebook. There are good people at Facebook. It wasn't that came totally unexpectedly. It obviously has been large. The effect there has been larger and more rapid in many cases than they expected. Well, that's the kind of thing where early in the life of that company, you could easily have said, here's an effect that we think is a negative externality of what is going to happen. Again, not a totally unforeseen one, just one that was not necessarily focused on. We could measure for it, right? We could say this is in the set of things we're gonna look for, and we're gonna put a metric on it. Silicon Valley technology industry, very good at putting metrics on things that we care about and things we want to either avoid or drive. And so we could put a negative metric on it. It's right. We would call these things zero metrics, or some things you want to keep really, really low, and then be transparent about it. Where are we on it? As it starts to get into a range that we are uncomfortable with, what are we going to do about it? And let's come back to it on some periodicity and say, how do we drive that into a place that we're more comfortable with it? And so I think exactly right. I mean, it's at some level, what we want to do is sort of create a lot of rigor and discipline and transparency on these things, so that we run them like we run other indicators of the firm. And it turns out right now that mostly what we will look at is growth and profitability and market share and other things. And those are important, and they're absolutely important. But there are other things that are important too, and we need to bring a similar level of rigor and discipline to those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Jon, I think that's probably a nice point where we can kind of pause our conversation here. I don't want to say stop, because I think as Responsible Innovation Lab continues to evolve. I mean, you just really launched formally just recently. I'm sure we're going to want you back to hear about the work that you're doing. But as you just launched, maybe as we close, is there anything that you want to maybe share with our students, our participants, or if they want to learn more, what they could do to learn more about the work that you and your colleagues are doing?
Yeah, David, no, first of all, thanks again for having me on. I appreciate it, and really appreciate the chance to have the conversation and tell folks about what we're working on. It's early days, lots of work, really all of the substantial work here is ahead of us. So we'll love to check back in and let you know how it's going, the good and the bad. If folks want to find out more about what we're doing, they can go to rilabs.org and take a look at some of the stuff we've got up there. It's again sort of early, not a ton of material there, but they can sign up to stay in touch, and we'll be sending out periodic updates and can learn more through that. So rilabs.org.
Well, thanks so much, Jon, for sharing a part of your afternoon with us. We appreciate it, and I know the thoughts and experiences that you shared are super relevant for students many who are like-minded in the sense of the work that you're doing. They're thinking about these issues. They know that they're important, and so you probably have reached out to the right group, and you'll have some followers now. So
awesome! I really appreciate it. Really appreciate it, David, and looking forward to it.
Super. Thanks, Jon.